Hello, this is in response to Looper Radical. Asked the question, very good question, in my opinion. And here's my response. He said, do you think there's a difference between martial arts as taught in suburbs versus inner cities? And, again, this may sound sarcastic, but yeah, of course, man. Where I grew up, we would often make fun of. See, to me, this seems obvious because I've trained in both environments and I've trained in urban environments. And, it seemed so obvious that when I was a kid, for example, if we heard a question that we thought was a dumb question, we'd go, right? As if to make fun of that person. But I'm not going to make fun of Looper Radical. It's a very good question. And the reason why it's a good question is oftentimes people who live in the suburbs don't train with people that live in the cities, especially inner cities, and vice versa. So they don't understand that oftentimes the effectiveness of your training is less dependent on the style than it is the way it's being trained, who's training the trainees, and the trainee pool themselves. Honestly, if you live in a nice suburban area and you really want to get into fighting, chances are you're going to get into a fight game. You're going to get into boxing, kickboxing, MMA, point karate, continuous taekwondo, and that's going to be most of your experience fighting, right? If you live in an urban area, if you live in a city, particularly in an inner city, or just in a place that has an inner city, and you want to get involved in fighting, you could just walk down the street, right? There's a demand for a capacity for violence, for giving it and receiving it and avoiding it and initiating it, or escalating it and de-escalating it. It's there, right? So that flavors everything. For example, on YouTube, the general consensus is that the MMA generation thinks Kung Fu is utterly useless. No one has ever won a fight using Kung Fu. They're utterly and completely wrong, because there's a lot of Kung Fu in inner cities, and those instructors often grew up in more violent settings than many of us have ever had to deal with. And so the whole time that they were learning a particular martial art, oftentimes they were having to apply it, and they found ways to make it work. Whereas, even if you train MMA and you train in the suburbs and you're real dedicated to it, you're really fit, and you train full time and you compete, you may have actually never had an actual act of personal violence thrown at you outside of the cage. And it's just different. It's just different. All right. I've knife handed people in the solar plexus and watched them not move. To me, a realistic martial art is one that includes a knife hand. I've hit people in the face with a palm for real. I've hit one guy in the chest with a palm, and then grabbed the loose flesh on his chest, and he was actually quite thin. To me, that's a real move that actually worked because I made it move. I've had several people in my life basically try and tackle me or do a double leg or single leg takedown. And some I wound up, they all took me down. They all succeeded in the takedown. A couple I actually wound up putting them in what I called a headlock, what you'd call a guillotine today. And others I reached down and pinch gripped their throat and then used the hand to hook their eye to lift them up and then hit their groin with a claw hand. And so to me, a tiger claw and a eagle claw, using the three fingers, and a groin grab are actual techniques. They've actually worked against people that were bigger, taller, stronger than me, that knew how to grapple. You understand? And that's because of violence that I had to live through. I've also had to deliver violence, and I'm not proud of that. I've had to sort of initiate violence, and then I've also been paid to manage other people's violence. Like I've bounced in a few bars, and I've done security and things like that. Right. So I've had experiences. To me, this outward white crane block is realistic because I've really used it against someone really trying to grab me who was drunk in a bar, and I had to go inside his elbows and turn him around and get behind him and grab his elbows from behind and unbalance him. It's not something you'll see in MMA or boxing or kickboxing, but you know, I got paid to use it. It looks real enough to me, right? So you could argue all day long. You could have used MMA, would have been more effective. You could have used Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, could have been more effective. Actually, in only a few of the grappling situations I've been with, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu have been an option, because in only a few of the grappling situations I've been in were there no bystanders, no possibility of someone intervening and kicking me, and no possibility of concrete or broken glass on the ground. So you could argue all day long that none of those real techniques that I really employed would have worked as well as your preferred technique. But I know what my real life was, and I know I had to really use them. And much of what I learned was either picked up in old school traditional martial arts, dojos and dojangs and so on, or kuns and so on and so forth, that were not necessarily in an urban neighborhood, but were taught in a very old school, harsh way, or some of the what you would call useless, flowery kung fu that I learned, Southern Five Animals and Five Ancestors. Some of what I was taught in an urban area by instructors that grew up in that type of environment, and some still lived in that environment and still had to manage violence in that environment. And so they just knew how to make it work, and they knew how to teach me how to make it work. Right? So, honestly, if you want to get really good at sport of MMA and kickboxing, oftentimes your best choice is one of the nicer suburban places, because they have many people competing in that sport, and some of them compete and come back to coach, and all and well. But if you have someone that grew up around violence, survived the violence, learned to manage violence, and has been successful at teaching other people how to successfully manage that violence, survive it, control it, counter it, continuously, you might have to go to that inner city. I don't know if I've answered that question properly, but that's the reaction off the top of my head. Okay. So, Looper Radical, as always, you do ask interesting questions, and I hope I responded, and thank you for being a fan, for liking and subscribing, and hope you're having a good day, man.